Howdy. Humanities 2 from Shasta College, summer school session. It is Wednesday. We have a little over a week of school left. I do believe the 22nd is the last day. We've got lots to cover, mostly all the time until the end. I posted the final paper on Citizen Kane. You got to watch the movie, analyze the movie. It's not a research paper where you Google it and just get information about the plot. I'm wanting you to see something. I put it into your words. You don't have to be right or wrong. What do you see? And I'm not talking about looking at the plot or if it makes sense or if it's in black and white. I get that. I'm talking about how'd the director do? Orson Welles, first time he directed a movie, he's 25 years old. How was the script? Orson Welles wrote it with Mankiewicz, and they won an Academy Award for it. Does it make sense? Do you care? How'd they handle the flashbacks? The script is very complicated, about a very complicated man. Kane, Charles Arthur Kane. And what are the themes in the movie? If you don't know what the theme is, Google it. Is it loss, love, power, unrequited love, fulfillment, ego? What do you think some of the themes are in the movies? And write a paragraph or two about it. How about the cinematography? That's the photography, folks. How'd the camera look? Greg Toland did the great camera work. He was inventing lenses. He was inventing things because they didn't have everything done when they made this movie in 1941. This movie changed the history of cinema. It was that groundbreaking. So look at those things. Look at the performances. These were all theater people. Very few of them, if any of them, had ever been in a movie before. They're from the Mercury Theater, which Orson Welles started in the 30s during the Depression and was supported by the government because FDR started giving money to the arts. FDR, the president at the time, Roosevelt, felt the arts were that important that maybe the government should give support to the arts. Whether you agree with that or not, that's up to you. But in Canada and in Britain, the government supports theater, supports film, supports television. So they do think it's worthy to support that. That's an important part of our culture. That's the other thing. This whole entire class is about what's going on in the culture at the time these artists were doing their best work. What was happening in the culture when Picasso was painting his paintings? I tell you, a lot. Besides pre-World War II and then World War II and the destruction of many parts of Spain. That's what's going on. What's going on when Hemingway was writing his novels? Well, World War I, for one, that helped the background on his first novel, then the Depression. And then World War II popped up, and he covered that as a war correspondent. Then the 50s, he became afraid of his mental illness, drank himself almost to death, and put a gun to his head and blew his head off because he thought he was going insane. He was probably what they would call bipolar, but they didn't have medication for that then. It ran in his family. Suicide runs in the Hemingway family. That's all part of their sad story. His youngest son, one of his sons, committed suicide. One of his granddaughters committed suicide. I think Hemingway's father committed suicide. It's a lot of suicide, folks. That'll make you write a novel, and it'll also could make you a drunk. It's a good excuse. So this is what's going on. Now what's going on in the cinema culture that I want you guys to focus on for this lecture I'm doing is I mentioned last week, I talked a lot. These lectures are a little bit longer than usual because I got a lot of ground to cover. So please stick with it, bear with it. Uh, I essentially started in the early films in 1900. Maybe you saw some of those clips I sent you. Hopefully you did. Take a moment to look at it because it will give you a better understanding of what I'm talking about and a better understanding about the art of cinema. And we went through the Roaring '20s, no liquor, gangster films, musicals, monster films of the '30s, escapism because of the Depression. And now we're coming out of the Depression. President Roosevelt has reinvested money, our taxpayers' money, into infrastructure. He is saying, let's build roads, let's build buildings, let's build bridges. And so people are going back to work. There's a hopeful feeling. We're coming out of the Depression, which was 10 years of pure drudgery in the general culture. Not everywhere was hit as hard as New York, Chicago, big cities. But the Depression affected everybody. The filmmakers, the writers, the painters, they were painting what they were feeling, what they saw, what they're living through, just like we're doing right now. So we're coming out of the dark Depression era, and in 1 year alone, 1939, folks, was a bumper crop year for Hollywood. Now, I'm sticking to Hollywood films for the most part. We don't have time to go to Europe or Asia. I might dip into there a little, but I don't want to overwhelm you guys with too much. I usually take an entire semester to teach this, not a week and a half. So, and if you thought movies were simply time wasters or popcorn, reason to eat popcorn or go to the theater and kill some time to be entertained, you might have to rethink that, because for 100 years now, over 100 years, cinema has changed the way we function as a culture. Absolutely, it has. And that's how profound the effect is or was, still having the effect. In a way, cinema has destroyed the reading culture, especially in the new everything faster, YouTube, TikTok is destroying the discipline to sit down with a book, because we want it all now in a few seconds of eye candy. That essentially, if you look deeper, it's pretty meaningless. You get to go deeper, you got to make something deeper and long lasting. You got to slow it down and observe the human experience. So, 1939, I can't list all the, you can put it, guess, you could Google this on Wikipedia and they'll show you the list of films. Maybe you've never heard of any of these. That's okay. I bet your great grandparents have, though. They grew up with this stuff. There's a list. Hollywood was busting at the seams after the Depression to get back on board and making big budgeted movies and with massive storytelling. And so the only three films I'm going to mention right now that came out all the same year, 1939, too numerous to name, but these three are touchstones of masterworks that changed the way we look at our lives around us. These weren't just merely entertainment. They were telling us something about who we are. Anyway, John Ford, the director, who directed over 150 movies, started in the silent era and directed a lot of Westerns with John Wayne, The Searchers, Fort Apache, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. That all came later, the late 40s and early 50s. They were expendable. But before he did that, he directed Stagecoach. And it started a theme and a paradigm that was created because of that movie. Stagecoach is a Western, and it's set supposedly in the Badlands, Indian territory, and these people all get on a stagecoach. They got to get to this other place, and so they're going to try to get there. And in the stagecoach, there's a drunken doctor who's escaping his hometown because he did a botched surgery because he was drunk. There is a prostitute. They don't call her a prostitute, but we know she is. The woman with the prostitute with the heart of gold. They're running her out of the town because the good women of the town think she's morally corrupt, even though the men all love her. So they're running her out of town. The gambler, they're running him out of town because he makes his living by gambling. Then there's the salesman who sells believe it or not, liquor. And the doctor is happy to meet him on the stagecoach because he partakes of the many samples of booze. Then there's the corrupted banker. He's on the stagecoach, and we don't know it, but he's bilked his customers out of lots of money. He's stolen a bunch of money. He's got it on him, and he's going across to he's escaping the town so he can live on his ill-gotten gains. And then there's the uptight school marm who is with child, and she is going to meet her husband who's in the military out at this fort. That's where the stagecoach is going. And she's very fussy about who she sits up with. She doesn't like the prostitute because, she's an ethical, moral woman, supposedly. She doesn't like the gambler. She doesn't like the drunk. She's kind of the moral equivalency of the society at large, being disapproving of anybody who's outside of society, and all these people are outside of society, polite society, I should say. And in the meantime, they pick up a hitchhiker, Ringo, the Ringo Kid, which is John Wayne, and he's pursued by the law, by the way, and he's off to a town that he wants to get to kill these guys who supposedly killed his brother. So he's on a revenge trip. In the meantime, he starts a conversation with the prostitute, doesn't know she's a prostitute, although she's dressed flamboyantly. She's got the red hair, blonde hair, and everybody looks at her disapprovingly, but he doesn't see what they see because he embraces her. He doesn't care what she is. And they start a romance without any physical proof of that. It's just the looks between each other. He treats her kindly. She's kind to him. The others know who she is, but he doesn't. He doesn't care. He's not judging her. That's John Wayne's movie that made him a star. Before then, he'd been in movies for about 10 years already. In really low budget, what they call B movies, Westerns. But this was his star breakout movie, directed by John Ford. And that year alone, 1939, John Ford directed 3 movies in 1 year, folks. And they were massive, epic movies. He usually worked in the historical epic area, our history. He did a movie called Young Mr. Lincoln about Abraham Lincoln before he became president, Henry Fonda. Then he did Drums Along the Mohawk, which was another movie with Henry Fonda, Claudette Colbert, where the settlers were settling the Mohawk Valley. This is in upstate New York during the Revolutionary War, and they are settling out there, pushing out further and further into Mohawk Indian territory. The Mohawks are working with the French, whoever, or the English, whoever, and so they are at war with them. These are rousing historical films, all teaching us a lesson about American grit, the Americans who settle America, supposedly. He did that all in 1 year. How did they do that? How did they do it? Make 3 movies in 1 year? And it's not like that anymore. In those days, it was a factory. It was a studio system that was incredibly well oiled. There were studios like Paramount, 20th Century, Universal, Warner Brothers, and they each sort of put out MGM. They each put out a sort of genre kind of films. MGM did usually big budgeted musicals in color, some of them. Warner Brothers was considered kind of low echelon. They put out a lot of gangster films and horror films. And the studios had hundreds of people working for them. They had hundreds of producers, hundreds of crew members making sets. They're making costumes. The screenwriters are writing screenplays in the office. The directors are signing these assignments. They don't pick and choose their assignments in those days. They are under contract to these studios, and they're not given much choice in the movies they're required to direct. And a successful director in those days is a director who could come in on budget. John Ford was one of those. He knew how to shoot a film with not a lot of fuss. It was like a factory, like building the Ford company cranking out Ford cars. And so he would make one movie, and while that movie's being made, the other movie is the sets are being built, casting is happening. Then he literally has a 2-week break, goes over to that movie, starts editing while his last movie is being edited. So you could put out a lot of work in 1 year. Now that all changed. Without getting too complicated, it all changed in the 60s when the studio system broke down. That documentary I want you guys to watch, Easy Rider, Raging Bulls, is going to be about your quiz. That explains that in there, the breakdown of the studios, and how all of a sudden studios were floundering and they became essentially houses for independent filmmaking. They weren't cranking out films like that anymore, and became another era, what they call the auteur era. I'll talk about that later. But it's in that documentary. You need to watch it. That's what your quiz is going to be based on. I'll be posting the quiz on Monday. You'll have about 12 hours to do it. Anyway, but more about that later on Monday. Another movie that broke a lot of barriers and for technology, because half of it was filmed in color, was The Wizard of Oz. Maybe you've seen it. Little Dorothy is living on a farm in Kansas, and she gets swept up in a tornado and crash lands in the land of Oz. That's in color, by the way. And there's a lot of freakish things happening in Oz. There's an evil witch who has flying monkeys for her henchmen. There's the good witch. There are little tiny people, munchkins, and she lands in Munchkin Land. And it's a surreal trip. And she befriends a lion who could talk, by the way, cowardly lion. She befriends a Tin Woodsman. And they all could talk, and they're all speaking. The Scarecrow and her little dog Toto's with her, and they need to get to the land of Oz to meet the great wizard so she can get home. Because the movie's message is there's no place like home. Now, if we were in class, I'd show you some clips of The Wizard of Oz, and I'd ask you this. After being in Oz, would you really want to go back to Kansas? It looks pretty dull. Black and white, everybody's boring, they're farmers. It's pretty exciting up there in Oz, wherever it is. It's in color. People are rocking. They're singing all the time. And after the evil witch dies, there's no evilness about Oz anymore. The witch is dead. Remember? Ding dong, the witch is dead. Anyway, but this was a revolutionary film which had great music like Somewhere Over the Rainbow, a great song. Judy Garland, who was the girl that was only supposed to be 12 or 13. She wasn't, obviously. And so they had to make her look like a child. They had to hide her womanhood by taping down her bosom so it looked like she didn't have any. They had to make her as innocent as possible, but she had that great singing voice. So it's not obviously a 13-year-old singing voice. And they tortured Judy Garland pretty much throughout the whole thing by keeping her thin. Hollywood still does that to women. They did everything in their power to keep her from eating, so she was always not feeling well. And you know how they did it, folks? Speed. They gave her, we would call it methamphetamines. They just called it amphetamines or whatever. They pumped her full of amphetamines. And her parents let that happen. Now, what that happened, eventually, it destroyed Judy Garland's life eventually. It took another 20 years, but she was addicted to amphetamines all her life to stay skinny. And let me tell you, when you're addicted that long, it affects everything. Not just your physical health, but your mental health. And to dampen that down, you drink a lot of booze. So by the time she died at, I think she was 47 years old, she looked like she's about 87, chain smoking, alcoholic, addicted to methamphetamines. Can you imagine? For 30 years. Judy Garland is a tragic story. It's a Hollywood cautionary story because a lot of people go to Hollywood to be stars. Beware what you wish for. When I was in Hollywood for 10 years, I lived with an actress. I was writing scripts and trying to figure out how to direct a movie. And she had to go on auditions all the time. She was a trained actor, meaning she went to school to train to be an actress. But the reality was her auditions were always about, will you take your clothes off? I'm not kidding. This was all the 80s. And every audition she went to, they asked her the question, are you willing to do nude? And these weren't kids. These aren't X-rated porn movies. These are regular straight films. And that's what women were asked to do. Many times she was asked to disrobe at the audition. She said no mostly, and she didn't get the part. That's how it rolled in those days. The Me Too society was run by horrible men casting agents who were trying to abuse their power with women. If you say no to me, I'll make sure you don't work in this town again. Think about Harvey Weinstein, if you know who I'm talking about. There was 100 Harvey Weinsteins. And these people had positions of power, and they abused it. Absolutely. So she would come home crying and go, this is not what I signed up for. I want to be an actress. I trained for it. I didn't train to just take my clothes off. And so that's what we're faced with as young people in Hollywood. And I hate to say it, you're probably still faced with it. That's what was going on during The Wizard of Oz. The abuse of a young woman to keep her thin and to control her every move. Judy Garland. And then there was another movie that was a groundbreaking movie. It's not a great movie, but at the time it was considered, I would compare it to Star Wars. It was that big. There was never been a bigger movie than Gone with the Wind, based on a best-selling novel. And it was a Civil War movie, and it was in color, folks. The entire movie was in color, not just a little bit of it. Stars Clark Gable, Vivian Leigh. And it broke all box office records. People adored that movie. Of my parents' generation, which is the Depression-era generation, they never seen anything like it. It was literally their Star Wars, their touchstone. My mother talked about that movie until the day she died. It meant that much to them. Clark Gable was so tall, dark, and handsome, and Vivian Leigh was so beautiful but neurotic. And it told the story of slavery and the Civil War and the South losing, because the people in the movie are Southern, the Confederacy. Now, is there racist overtones in this movie? Absolutely. Her maids are all black, and they're all very played in a cliche way, what they call kind of Aunt Jemima type of attitude where they play dumb because they can't play smart around their white owners or they'll get sold off. And so her black slaves have to be always playing dumb or you get punished for it. And so there is that aspect of it. Was that true? Absolutely. Is it racism? Absolutely. But the movie, the African-American actors in the movie all played those sorts of parts. Nobody played a person of high quality dignity. They all played sort of like the slaves to the rich people. And so there's this definite bent there. Now they pulled it when we had the Black Lives Matter protest. They actually pulled a lot of movies off the streaming sites. That was one of them. Now they brought it back because it's a beloved movie, and there's a at the first of the movie there is a can't think what it's called, but where the guy comes out and talks about beware, there are racial stereotypes in this movie. Think about the times, and people have to be lectured to because we're too stupid to figure it out ourselves. So there is this precursor to essentially the rating system. So they could keep making money off this movie, and people could keep watching it. But there is this disclaimer, they call it a disclaimer at the movie, that we know it's a racist film. It still has qualities that, please view it in that context. So those three movies all came out in 1939. So that meant people were going back to the movies. People were going back to work. We're not in World War II yet, folks, but that nightmare is beginning in Europe already because by 1939, Hitler was bombing London, and he's also had invaded Poland. He was on the move. FDR was very well aware of it. The Congress did not want FDR to help. People had just come through World War I, and they did not want to get involved in another grinding, expensive war where we lose hundreds of thousands of our guys in the war. And so England asked our help for 2 years straight as they were being bombed every night. And we didn't do anything. Our best interest, according to the voters, was to stay out of it. So we did. What got us involved in it, besides Hitler coming into France and occupying Paris, was Pearl Harbor. You know when Pearl Harbor was? December 7th, 1941. As FDR said, the day of infamy. Japan attacked our base in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, Hawaii in those days wasn't a state, but we had a huge naval force there, and we got caught unawares, and they destroyed most of our Navy and killed 3,000 or 4,000 people in a sneak attack that changed the entire world for the next 20 years. After that, immediately, Germany declared war on us, and because there was this fascist axis that involved Germany, Italy, and Japan. And so we went to war. To get the war machine going, we had to raise a lot of money really fast. Japan decimated our Navy. We had to come up with a way of getting money that just wasn't waiting for the taxes every year. So they started selling war bonds. You can buy a war bond for $5, $20, $50. They started selling them everywhere. At movie theaters was a popular place to sell it. You buy your ticket, or you buy a war bond. You go inside, there's a commercial for war bonds. Movie stars were out there stumping to get the American people to buy war bonds so we could get the war machine going. And we were raising millions of dollars a day on these war bonds. And that's how we made the mechanisms to do war, tanks to ships to machine guns to bullets. And then the draft started, and people were flooding the draft centers. It was at one time an all-volunteer army, but they declared a draft so you could get drafted for the first time, men only, of course. And but nobody, a lot of people didn't want to wait to get drafted. They went down and joined because they knew that we'd gotten attacked and we wanted to get paid back. And so the army was filling up. We have to have money to train these guys, to feed them, to house them, to give them clothes to wear and guns to shoot. And so how do you get all that? Through a lot of money. And so Hollywood, I'm going to show you this documentary. I hope you guys watch it, called Hollywood Goes to War. It's only 15 minutes long. And it shows how Hollywood embraced the war for war bonds and how people are willing to give more money to celebrities. They still are. If a celebrity goes out there and asks for money, they'll get it. A lot, usually. And so these movie stars put their star power to use. And so that was happening. Americans started putting out World War movies. And for the most part, they were propaganda films. Some great World War II movies starring John Wayne and other people. John Wayne didn't go into the army. He had kids at the time and he opted out. It was his choice. John Ford, who worked with him for many years, never forgave him for that. He felt he took a coward's way out. But John Wayne, no matter what you think about him, he helped the war effort tremendously. These movies racked in the money. And when they go see a John Wayne movie like the Sands of Iwo Jima or the Fighting Seabees, they would buy more war bonds like crazy. So John Wayne really did he contributed to the war effort. He just didn't go over and risk his life. Other movie stars did. They actually quit their careers to join the army. In that little documentary you watch, people like Clark Gable and Tyrone Power, maybe you know who those are. They were stars. There's like Johnny Depp and Brad Pitt joining the army now. That's how big they were. Why would you give your career up to go do that? Because they believed in the cause. Did they get killed? Absolutely. Some of them did. Leslie Howard, who's a co-stars in Gone with the Wind, a British actor, he was English, but he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he was shot down in 1942. He didn't live, folks, and he's one of the stars of Gone with the Wind. And many, many other wonderful English films like The Scarlet Pimpernel, whatnot. He was at the top of his acting game. I don't think he was even just in his 30s. And he died for this cause. Carol Lombard, who was a screwball comedy actress at the time, married to Clark Gable, was on a tour in an airplane getting war bonds, and her plane crashed actually out by the Death Valley desert. It crashed into a mountain, and everybody on board, including her mother, was killed. And she was 33 years old. And I wish we had time. I'd show some clips with her. It's in that little documentary. You'll see it. She did some of the best, what I would call screwball comedies ever, like My Man Godfrey, On the 20th Century. Her last movie is To Be or Not to Be. And she is beyond description, feisty, alive woman who could stand along men. She was not a pushover, let's put it that way. So people died. They gave up their careers. It's a documentary. You guys go look at some of it on the trailer. I'll show it. It's called Five Came Back. 5 very successful movie directors. John Ford was one of them. Frank Capra was another one. Williamweiler. It's okay if you don't know these names, but I bet you've seen the movies. George Stevens and John Huston all quit their day jobs, which is successful Hollywood writers and directors, to join the army. Now, most of them were too old to be fighting the war, but because they're all in their 40s, and John Ford was like 60, but they filmed a film division that John Ford headed up, Frank Capra headed up, actually, and they filmed the war. Any footage you've ever seen of World War II was filmed by this film group. John Ford went to the Pacific. He shot a documentary called The Battle of Midway. That's real footage, folks. Those are real Japanese Zeros crashing into our ships. Other directors were in Europe. They filmed D-Day. They filmed the D-Day invasion. Maybe you've seen Saving Private Ryan. There's some authentic footage from D-Day in that documentary and in that movie. You've seen this footage over and over because there's not that much footage. You know why there's not that much footage at D-Day? Because most of the cameramen were killed, and their cameras went down to the bottom of the ocean. Cameramen weren't shooting at the enemy; they're shooting film, so the American people could see what was going on. Look at Saving Private Ryan. That's D-Day, folks. Carnage. Thousands of our guys were killed within minutes of getting off those boats. It's when we invaded Europe, and the long defeat of Hitler was on the way for sure. These directors went over there, gave up their careers to film the war, to do their part in this cause that they believed in. Can you imagine a rich director or an actor, any of them now, somebody you admire, quitting their jobs to go fight in Afghanistan? Can you imagine that? Well, the reason why you can't, because nobody did. Somebody did, though. You probably don't know him. He was a football star. And as soon as not Afghanistan, but it was in Iraq, he volunteered he had just signed a $3 million contract to a football team. He decided to not do that. He wanted to, after 9/11, when the towers came down, he felt that he wanted to serve his country. And so he did. And he was killed for it. There's a great documentary about his serving the military and how he actually got killed. George Bush Jr., the second Bush was the president, and they used his death as a way to get money and prop up their propaganda for the war. See, propaganda is really big, folks. Keep people interested, keep people excited about the war. Because as soon as you start hearing the truth, people start not believing in the war anymore. Vietnam was like that. That's my war. We all have a good war. And once the press got over to Vietnam, they saw what was really going on. It wasn't about fighting communism. It was about something else going on. Power grab, imperialism, whatever you want to call it. But almost 60,000 kids died in Vietnam for essentially nothing. That's another story, though. Go watch Apocalypse Now. You'll know what I'm talking about. A Full Metal Jacket, to get your insights on Vietnam War. Anyway, film-wise. So after they found this guy was shot and killed, and so the government said he's a hero. And so people believed that he was killed on the line of action. And it wasn't until later that they found out how he really died. He was killed by our own guys. When you're in a combat situation, folks, sometimes you don't know who the hell you're shooting at. and there's a lot of bullets flying, and he was in front of somebody, and people were firing over his head, and they hit him. So he was shot by what they call friendly fire. His own guys killed him, and the government tried to cover it up. In the documentary, his parents were so outraged when they found out the government covered up how he really died that they forbade the government to use his name to raise money and calling him a hero, because he wasn't a hero. He died like a lot of our guys die of friendly fire. World War II, we were constantly killed our own guys by accident. Yeah, it's a great documentary, and it shows you how we're still trying to use propaganda to this day. But who was going to walk away from a $3 million contract to go fight in a war that is dissipated now? We don't even know what it's about anymore. Some people say it's about oil. Some people said it was about terrorism. We're just pulling out of Afghanistan right now. We've been there for 20 years, folks. What's any good come out of it? The Taliban is already controlling most of the country. As soon as we're gone, we'll see. Anyway, so think about that. These 5 directors went to fight for the country the best way they knew how, with a movie camera. And they got some incredible footage. And if I encourage you guys to see the documentary. 5 came back. I think it's on one of the streaming channels. I don't know if it's Netflix or Amazon. It's there. It's 5 parts. Big producers, Steve Spielberg, Tom Hanks. They're behind that documentary about these directors coming back. I've read the book. I've seen the movies. And it is... Were they heroes? Absolutely. They were trying to film the truth. And of course, they would send the film stock back. Washington, the Pentagon would squish it. They wouldn't let people see it because it showed Americans getting killed. And the Pentagon said no. The American people can't take it. And so they'd use this footage in newsreels, but only if it showed no American dead. And these guys saw hundreds of American dead bodies. George Stevens, who later on directed, so many movies out of when he came back, and Frank's Story and others, Giant, James Dean. He was there when they found the first death camp, concentration camp. And no, we'd heard about them. We didn't know for a fact if it was real. It was real, folks. He filmed all the piled up corpses of the dead Jews, homosexuals, intellectuals that Hitler had put in the concentration camp and either starved to death or burned them to death or gassed them to death. He found them. He was profoundly... Talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome. He had it big time. And you know how they dealt with it in those days, folks? They came home, became drunks. That's not how they do now. They have maybe been in the military, maybe you know what I'm talking about. Now they actually have therapists and psychiatrists in the battlefield. So when you come back from a firefight, you actually could talk to somebody right now about it. They didn't have that in Vietnam either. They suppressed it. So they'd seen this horror of people being slaughtered, civilians. They maybe pulled the trigger on some civilians, whatever. Their buddies are getting killed right next to them. Why are they alive? And so my generation was full of nothing but people coming back from the war addicted to drugs. It is better now because they know that to experience warfare is a traumatic experience, and people don't get over it. My dad's entire generation were alcoholics. I'm not kidding. That's how they dealt with it. And they never talked about it. They're too proud to talk about it, but they drank themselves. And I didn't know that until later on when I would talk to my friends. All of our dads are drunks. There might have been exceptions, but that's how they handled it. The pain was through liquor. So these 5 directors go over there, they come back, and they make some of the greatest movies of their entire career. And John Ford had already won the Academy Award twice, for how I think he won for The Informer and possibly Grapes of Wrath, maybe How Green Was My Valley. He'd already won it twice, folks. They came back and they couldn't make the same movie anymore. They had changed. The war changed them. They no longer could make propaganda films. So the movie studios wanted to have John Ford direct a war film. He said, absolutely not, unless I could direct it and do it the way I saw it. He scared the studios, but he was powerful. And they said, okay. So he made a movie called They Were Expendable, where we lose, folks. John Wayne stars in it, Robert Montgomery. It's in the Pacific, it was the very first PT boat experiment that we had. And most of the early PT boats, maybe you know what that is, patrol small boats that could tack bigger ships. Hundreds of those guys died. And John Ford he goes, unless I could tell my movie the way I saw it, I can't make up a propaganda film. And so it ends on a sad note. We've been defeated. And early on in World War II, the Japanese kicked our ass until we got our war machine up and running in more of the middle to late 40s. Then 41, 42, 43, we were the underdogs. Hard to believe. And so that's the movie he makes. Williamweiler makes a movie called The Best Years of Our Lives in 1946. And it was about 3 returning veterans who are coming back from the war to their hometown and how they can adjust. It was the first film to ever show the reality of being in a war for 4 years and trying to come back and have a normal life. How do you do that? One of the guys is a banker, and he comes back to his old job, and he wants to give bank loans now to veterans and to other people. And the bank managers just think he's crazy. He goes, you can't give money to these people. And he goes, these people fought. They dedicated their lives to defeat Hitler. I'm going to get them a home loan, whether you like it or not. And so he was going against the norm. Another guy who was a pilot in it, handsome pilot with a leather jacket, came back, got his old job. He worked as a soda jerk at a Woolworths. And many know what a soda jerk means. It'd be like working like a barista at Starbucks. He served milkshakes and Cokes and hamburgers. That's the job he had before he went to the war. Now, how can he be a lieutenant fighter pilot and come back to that? It does not work out for him. And he's married to a really glamorous looking blonde who loves him in that uniform, because that's when they got married. She married the uniform. How handsome he was, heroic. Well, he's out of the Army now, and he doesn't wear the uniform anymore. And they go out to dinner, and she begs him to wear the uniform. He goes, I'm not in the Army anymore. And she goes, please, for me, wear the uniform. She was in love with the myth of that uniform, not with him. And of course, she leaves him for another guy. She wasn't worth it. Then he finds the right girl who believes in him. That helps. And then the third guy is a guy who lost both hands in the war. And he comes back to his hometown to a girl that wants to marry him and his parents, and they have to deal with the fact that he has hooks for hands. The actor who did that didn't have his hands in real life. He was never acted before. They cast him. He had lost his hands in the war, but not in combat. He lost in a demolition mishap in training, lost both of his hands. And so they got him. And he's incredible in this movie. He's real. It shows him rolling a cigarette. That's how they wrote. Then, a lot of people didn't have packs of cigarettes that much. And he rolled his own cigarettes. He did everything with his hands, but he couldn't touch his girlfriend. He had hooks, metal hooks for hands, folks. He wanted to kill himself. But then finally they figure out a way that he's going to live without his hands. How he can have a life without his hands. Actually, they gave that gentleman a Special Academy Award for acting that year because it was that devastating, real, and realistic. Best years of our lives. How do you adjust to coming home after you've been in combat for 4 years? You're going to need a lot of sympathy and understanding. I'm trying to think who the other directors were. George Stevens did the Anne Frank story. Anne Frank hiding in the Jewish girl in Amsterdam, hiding from the Nazis. She lived in the attic with her family for 2 years before they discovered her. Took her off to a concentration camp. She died and wrote the Anne Frank diaries. That's what his movie is based on. John Huston came back and wrote and directed Treasure Sierra Madre, brilliant movie with Humphrey Bogart. Then he did African Queen later. These guys were huge directors and writers. They came back out of the war. They had changed. The war had changed them. They couldn't make entertaining movies anymore. It was hollow. It was false. It wasn't the truth. The war changed all that. Look for the documentaries on Canvas. Keep up the good work. Talk to you later this week when Story of Film continues. And remember, everything is cinema.